Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a moment in history that quite literally altered the trajectory of the 20th century. We're going to look closely at Japan's path to total war, and specifically, how a desperate need for resources pushed an island nation to execute one of the most shocking and audacious military gambles of all time. So let's dive right into the geopolitical pressure cooker that had completely backed Japan into a corner by 1941. To really grasp why the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, we kind of have to look past the military strategy for a minute and focus on the sheer economics of an expanding empire. How does a lack of basic, everyday materials like oil and scrap metal force a country to take on a massive naval superpower? Well, it's an absolutely fascinating chain of cause and effect.
Section 1. The Imperial Resource Trap. Japan's need for supplies.
Japan's aggressive military expansion was escalating rapidly. But in 1939, they suffered a massive defeat by the Soviet Union at the Battle of Nomonhan, taking 18,000 casualties. That brutal loss effectively closed off any hopes for northern expansion. And really, it gave the Japanese Navy exactly the ammunition they needed to argue that the Pacific, down to the south, should be their next target. By April 1941, they signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets just to secure that northern border, and by July, they were already moving into southern Indochina. The dominoes were falling fast, leading right up to December 1941, when the Japanese government made the monumental final decision to declare war on the US, Britain, and the Netherlands.
Now, in response to that rapid expansion, the United States imposed a truly suffocating embargo. We're talking oil, gasoline, iron ore, coal, copper, rubber, the works. This wasn't just a political slap on the wrist, it was a stranglehold. It effectively starved the Japanese military machine of the exact raw materials it needed to even function, forcing their leadership into a very desperate corner. And if the physical embargo wasn't enough, there was a financial one too. By mid-1941, Japanese assets in U.S. banks were completely frozen. They literally couldn't even buy the oil if they managed to find someone willing to sell it to them. Combined with similar, really severe restrictions from British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, Japan felt the walls closing in. They genuinely believed they had absolutely no choice but to acquire these essential resources by force, through military conquest in Southeast Asia. Section 2. Planning a preemptive strike. A desperate plan. The Japanese leadership fully realized that seizing those oil-rich territories from the British and the Dutch would inevitably drag the United States into the war. But here's the thing. Japan knew it couldn't possibly win a long-term economic war against the U.S. The American economy and naval capacity were just way too massive. So, under the direction of Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, they decided to gamble everything on a devastating first blow. The idea was a preemptive strike to completely destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet while it was sitting in port. This would neutralize their ability to respond, buying Japan just enough time to conquer and fortify the Pacific region. But where would that massive blow actually land? Well, the U.S. military entirely expected an attack in the Philippines, and honestly, it was a perfectly reasonable assumption. The Philippines were only 200 miles from Japanese bases on Formosa, but Japan's actual target was the U.S. Pacific Fleet's home base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which was commanded by Rear Admiral Husband Kimmel and home to nearly 100 ships. The U.S. completely, totally underestimated the sheer audacity of targeting a base so far away. And here is exactly why they underestimated it. 3,400. That massive number represents the distance in miles between Japan and Pearl Harbor. To U.S. commanders at the time, launching a massive multi-carrier strike force across 3,400 miles of open ocean completely undetected seemed virtually impossible. It was a logistical nightmare that ultimately provided the Americans with a very fatal false sense of security. Section 3. The Undetected Approach. The Stealth Fleet. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo commanded a truly massive armada. We're talking 6 aircraft carriers, over 20 escort ships, fuel tankers, and 16 submarines. Moving a stealth fleet of this size across the Pacific is just mind-boggling. They maintained absolute, strict radio silence and purposefully avoided all the main shipping lanes. And crucially, while Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii was focusing his limited reconnaissance planes to the southwest toward the Marshall Islands, this massive Japanese fleet was quietly creeping in from the completely unexpected north. Now, there were warnings, but they were tragically ignored. At 3:45 a.m. on the morning of the attack, a Japanese midget submarine was actually spotted. And then at 6:45 a.m., U.S. radar picked up the incoming first wave of aircraft. But because a flight of U.S. B-17 bombers was expected to arrive that very same morning, the radar report was entirely dismissed. Compounding all of this, U.S. military intelligence back in Washington had actually been intercepting codes, indicating spies were identifying ship locations in the harbor, but that vital, urgent information never reached the base in Hawaii in time. And the preparations on the ground only made things worse. Because military leaders thought an air attack was impossible, actually scratch that, they specifically believed the water in Pearl Harbor was too shallow for torpedoes, they just didn't install anti-torpedo nets. Even worse, the Army commander had ordered all aircraft to be bunched tightly together in the dead center of the airfields, entirely unarmed. Why? To protect them from local saboteurs. Over on the naval side, anti-aircraft ammunition was locked away securely. They were perfectly prepared for the completely wrong threat. Section 4. The Day of Infamy. December 7th, 1941. The timeline of the attack itself is shockingly brief. At 7:55 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, the first wave of low-level torpedo planes and dive bombers struck. There was zero U.S. response. Complete, total surprise had been achieved, which prompted Captain Fuchida to send the famous code, Tora, Tora, Tora. Exactly an hour later, at 8:55 a.m., a second, even larger wave of 168 aircraft attacked. This time they faced chaotic anti-aircraft fire and incredibly dense smoke from all the burning ships. But by 9:45 a.m., in just under 2 hours, the entire attack was over. The psychological impact on the U.S. leadership was immediate and devastating. U.S. Staff Officer Lieutenant Ken Murray, who was standing right next to the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, recalled Admiral Kimmel's silently watching the destruction of his fleet and then physically tearing off his own 4-star shoulder boards. This firsthand account really captures the crushing shock of a naval leader realizing that his entire strategic reality, not to mention his career, had been completely overturned in a matter of minutes. For the men on those ships, the human terror was just unimaginable. Marine Richard Fisk recalled the horrifying explosion of the battleship USS Arizona. When the ship's forward magazines exploded, 1,103 crew members died instantly. For many, as Fisk said, the sheer scale of the violence didn't even process as reality at first. It felt like a waking nightmare that they only really comprehended after they managed to swim to shore. Section 5. Strategic Misstep. Reversal of Fortune. The immediate aftermath revealed a widely asymmetrical loss. The U.S. lost or suffered severe damage to 18 ships, including 8 massive battleships. They lost 164 aircraft, and tragically, 2,403 lives were lost. Japan, on the other hand, lost just 29 aircraft, 6 easily replaceable midget submarines, and 64 men. Tactically speaking, it was a masterpiece for the Japanese Navy. But, as we know, wars aren't won on a single morning spreadsheet. Because the true story lies in what Japan missed. See, they didn't send in a planned third wave, which meant they left the absolute most critical elements of the U.S. Navy intact. The USS Enterprise and Lexington, the vital aircraft carriers, were out at sea on maneuvers, so they survived. 4.5 million barrels of fuel were left sitting completely untouched. Their repair shops and dry docks survived without a scratch. And because the harbor water was so shallow, the U.S. was eventually able to raise and repair all but 3 of the damaged ships. By leaving all that infrastructure intact, Japan pretty much ensured the U.S. Navy could fight another day. Which leaves us with this final, really profound question. Did Japan's greatest tactical victory actually guarantee its ultimate destruction? Think about it. By launching a sneak attack, they galvanized a deeply divided American public into enthusiastically backing a total war effort. They woke a sleeping giant with an economy and a technological capacity that Japan simply could not compete with in the long term. This brilliant, perfectly executed surprise attack was, in the very end, the fatal mistake that eventually brought the war to their own shores. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer on the anatomy of this incredible strategic gamble.